Alien Rogue Incursion is a tale of two very different halves. On one hand, it's packed with authentic franchise-accurate environments, a cinematic visual style we don't often see in virtual reality, impeccable atmosphere throughout, and some truly awesome fan service moments that had me, a lifelong admirer of everything Alien, grinning from ear to ear. But on the other hand, it's a weird feeling, unconventional and at times frustrating VR game filled with strange design choices and some sneaky, potentially dishonest marketing. During the game's roughly 6-hour campaign, I found myself bouncing back and forth between confusion, utter delight and frustration thanks to the plethora of bizarre design choices made by developers Survios. I'd say I enjoyed 65% of the overall experience thoroughly. Watching Xenomorphs scurry across the walls, dash to ceilings and then leap at me from a distance never got old. It fulfilled a VR fantasy I've had for years, and blasting these imposing foes with the beautiful sounding pulse rifle makes up the vast majority of the game's runtime. But for the other 35% of the experience, I found myself questioning the fundamental mechanics of the game, fighting against the control scheme, getting lost looking for my objectives, and of course, battling some nasty bugs and glitches, something that's becoming increasingly prevalent in newer VR titles. It's a real shame to say this, but I do think VR purists will bounce off of Alien Rogue Incursion almost immediately due to the way the game feels to play. Survios gets so much right here when it comes to building an authentic Alien experience for VR users. It's a game that looks and sounds like it was ripped directly from the movies, but when it comes to embodying the character, I spent a good chunk of the runtime wondering if this was originally intended to be a flat screen game, because it's often an experience that feels closer to a VR mode than a built for VR title. In my humble opinion, Alien Rogue Incursion is better than Alien's Colonial Marines, and it does succeed in giving fans an action-packed romp through this beloved universe, but it fails to reach the dizzy heights of Alien Isolation by a decent margin, and if you go into this one expecting anything more than a run-and-gun shoot-em-up against one of pop culture's coolest movie monsters, you might leave a little bit disappointed. Contact! Back at the start of this review, I mentioned the game's potentially dishonest marketing. That's because this is actually Alien Rogue Incursion Part 1. Now, I have scoured the internet looking for any mention of this and I couldn't find one anywhere. So let me just confirm this right now. This is the first part of this story, with Part 2 in active development right now. This raises a bunch of questions. Was the game meant to ship as a longer product? Was it split in half to ensure the release date was met? Is Part 2 a separate product that consumers need to purchase, or is it an update to this game? I expect we'll never truly know the real story, but I am keen to hear from Survios about the plan for the second half of the story as far as cost and release date are concerned. Now that you have been forewarned about potentially getting half of a game, let me briefly set the scene for this new Alien adventure. Players step into the shoes of Zula Hendricks, a colonial marine from the written word and comic book extended Alien universe, as she explores a research facility on the planet Padan with her trusty AI companion Davis-01. This is very much an Aliens style experience. Zula is a fully equipped and capable marine who isn't afraid to go toe to toe with the Xenomorph threat. You won't be cowering in cupboards or hiding from aliens here. You'll be squaring up against them and melting dozens of them into little piles of acid with the iconic pulse rifle, a revolver sidearm and a pump action shotgun. This is a VR action game more than anything else. Occasionally you will be tasked with some light puzzle solving, which is almost always in the form of a junction box that needs rewiring Bioshock style, but then you'll quickly revert to blasting Xenos in the face and pushing forwards with the story. You're given free rein to explore at your own pace throughout the game's runtime, and there are optional rooms to discover, audio logs to find and supplies to scavenge, but from my experience, this isn't really advised, as the aliens seem to be on some kind of respawn timer. Every few minutes, 2 or 3 Xenos will spawn in and try to kill you, appearing from a vent or sprinting round a corner to bite your face. It helps to keep the pace snappy, as you can find yourself running low on ammunition if you take your sweet time exploring, but it is a shame that you can quickly predict roughly when aliens are going to show up, as the intervals between the unscripted attacks seem almost identical each time. Now, I won't touch any deeper on the story here, as there are a bunch of great fan service moments that I wouldn't want to spoil throughout this journey. But let me just say, if you're a big fan of the franchise, then Rogue Incursion hits a lot of the beats you'd expect from an Alien story. There's not a lot here that will necessarily surprise you, but there's plenty that will put a smile on your face. Let's talk a little bit about the stars of the show. The reason we're all here, your primary source of cannon fodder during this adventure, the Xenomorphs. What's it like to go toe-to-toe with them in VR, and how does it compare to something like Alien Isolation, an unofficial but excellent VR mod experience which does an incredible job of making one single Xenomorph feel so utterly terrifying? Well, here in Rogue Incursion, the Xenomorph drones aren't anything like the intelligent, imposing and horrifying beast you spent hours hiding from in Isolation. Don't get me wrong, I loved seeing these iconic creatures leaping into vents, climbing all over the environment and sprinting towards me. It was always fun to fill them with bullets. They look fantastic and their movement and pathing through the environments is awesome, but for the most part these aliens will be reduced to a steaming pile of acid long before they've had a chance to lay their hands on you if you decide to play on normal difficulty, and it quickly becomes a by the numbers, shoot them until they're dead gameplay loop. The first hour of Rogue Incursion is definitely its most impactful section as far as Xenomorphs go. It slowly builds them up as a threat and drops them in a few at a time to really build the tension. These first few encounters are genuinely scary, and as the game rolls on, the odd alien will manage to pop up behind you to give you a healthy jump scare. But generally speaking, the longer you play, the less of a threat these creatures seem, and the more mundane your encounters with them become. 1 or 2 will pop up every few minutes if you take your time exploring, and then predetermined set pieces will have you fighting 3 or 4 at the same time in wave-based sections of combat. Ultimately, they are here to be shot at. The Steam page for Rogue Incursion talks about using Zula's stealth skills to survive, but during the entirety of my playthrough, I cannot recall ever being able to successfully hide from a Xenomorph. Stealth never feels like an option, as the creatures spawn in and path pretty much directly to you. It's a very different experience to the stalking, hunting and unpredictable behaviour of the alien in Isolation, so don't go in expecting that level of terror or intelligence. Okay, let's dive into the most interesting aspect of Alien Rogue Incursion, and the thing that I expect will be extremely divisive when the game launches and VR players start embarking on this adventure. Developers Survios have designed Alien Rogue Incursion in such a way that it often feels like a flat screen game. There are design choices present here that essentially fly in the face of VR Dev 101, and how much they irritate you will likely boil down to how much of a VR purist you are. Firstly, Rogue Incursion is filled with micro animations, little baked in movements, actions and scripted things that your player character does even if you yourself are not doing those things in real life. You know how a character's arms and guns sway and bounce slightly from side to side when you walk or run in a flat screen FPS? Well, your character does that here in Rogue Incursion. If you reach out towards a supply briefcase, your hand will magically magnetize or snap to it from a few inches away. Reloads are performed manually, but part of the process is an animation aided by your controller movements. Jumping is an automatically triggered event that happens when you run towards an edge or gap in terrain, and when you do it, you can almost feel the animation of your character lurching forward and swinging their legs. When you bring your gun up to your shoulder, it snaps into a fixed ADS position until you move your arms far enough out to go back to normal aiming mechanics. VR purists will almost certainly hate this. I personally didn't mind it after the initial realization that this was the kind of game Survios had opted to make. If you can accept it for what it is, you'll blast through the game having a decently fun time, but a recurring theme of Rogue Incursion is definitely accepting it for what it is. These choices bleed into other areas of the game too. The inventory, for example, can be summoned by holding a button to create holographic versions of the tools you have access to, rather than grabbing those same items from pouches on your body or a backpack from your shoulder. Now thankfully, guns do buck this trend and they are grabbed from both shoulder slots and a hip slot, but in most hectic moments and intense gunfights, I found myself reaching for a grenade and ending up with a shotgun, or reaching for a pistol and ending up with nothing, due to the placement of some of these holsters. Luckily, the game does offer a pretty comprehensive menu for adjusting these things, as the default positions definitely left me for dead more than once. Ultimately, piloting Zula through Rogue Incursion felt like a hybrid VR experience, a game that was built for flat screen and then adapted to VR. It's better than something like Hitman 3's VR mode, and many casual VR players might not even notice it, but those who spend a lot of time inside headsets and are used to games that adhere to the expectations of VR game development might be surprised with how this one feels to play. On PC, Alien Rogue Incursion can be a decent looking game with a thick, suffocating atmosphere if you have the system to back it up, but don't expect this to set a new high bar for VR visuals. The best thing about Rogue Incursion is undeniably its art direction. These locations look so authentic. The first few moments walking around planetside on Padan felt like I had stepped straight into the movie Aliens, thanks to the lighting effects, snow swirling around me, and the imposing research facility emerging from the dark. The colour palette, retro sci-fi terminals, xenomorph designs, facehugger designs, weapon designs, and ambient effects like smoke from vents and sparks from overhead light fixtures really do sell this experience to you as an authentic, official, and canon Alien adventure. The sound design is equally impressive. Every voice actor involved does a fantastic job of bringing these characters to life, and iconic sounds like the motion tracker beep, pulse rifle firing, or xenomorph snarls and screeches are all wonderfully replicated here. At face value, it looks and sounds great, but there are also issues in this department too. I personally ran the game with everything set to epic and pixel density set to 1.2. This gave me the best balance of sharp visuals and acceptable performance, with anything lower than this looking bizarrely blurry. However, it was evident that setting the game this high in terms of graphics options meant it wasn't quite running at the high frame rate I would have liked, which resulted in a motion blur or reprojection style effect in some areas when moving my hands around or turning my head too quickly. The game also seems to have some kind of film grain or soft focus effect applied to it. Nothing ever looks as sharp and defined as I'd like it to, whilst also maintaining a decent level of performance, and there's currently no DLSS options at the time of writing, meaning you'll need to adjust your settings accurately based on the system you have. As a side note, I do feel sorry for anyone who has to run this game on low settings. For fun, I set everything to low on PC and turned the game into a PS1 era blocky, blurry, pop-in riddled nightmare of an experience. It's great that it's playable, but I don't think I've ever seen low settings reduce a VR game on PC to this level of ugly. One day I will write a review for a new high-profile VR game that doesn't include a bugs and glitches section, but sadly today is not that day. Alien Rogue Incursion threw a wide range of issues at me on PC, from small things like xenomorphs completely disappearing the second they die or getting stuck in the scenery, to mildly frustrating things like player arms stretching and getting caught inside objects, to game-breaking things like a hard crash I had every single time I tried to load into one of the game's final areas, or the reliable crank item that would fall through the floor every single time I tried to interact with it, meaning I could not shut off the valve that I needed to switch off to progress the game. I threw myself at many of these bugs several times and brute forced my way through them, but that hard crash during the late game section in the medical center, around 4.5 hours of playtime playtime in was a dead end I could not brute force through. Instead, I needed to start the entire game again from the beginning thanks to Rogue Incursion's single save slot system with no backup auto saves. In Rogue Incursion, you save the game by docking your datapad into a computer inside the game's many panic rooms dotted around the research facility. Doing this saves your progress over your previous save, but it doesn't give you, the player, an option to make multiple save points in one playthrough, meaning when I hit this game-breaking bug, I could not roll back the clock and instead needed to start the entire game again. It's so disappointing to keep reporting the sorry state of high-profile games like this. Maybe I got unlucky with Rogue Incursion. You might have a far smoother experience, but ultimately, the appropriate level of testing and polish has once again not been applied to the latter half of a new VR game, and it can result in players like myself experiencing immersion-breaking annoyances or losing hours of progress. Alien Rogue Incursion isn't a bad game, but it isn't a fantastic game either. It's ultimately a straightforward sci-fi VR shooter set in one of the most iconic pop culture universes of all time, but it doesn't ever quite live up to the potential of the franchise that it's based on. The Xenomorphs are undeniably cool. The environments feel authentic. The sound design is near perfect, and a healthy dose of fan service moments will keep die-hard Alien fans grinning throughout the campaign. But strange VR design choices, by-the-numbers shooting, repetitive gameplay, and a host of bugs that might halt progression or worse, force you to start a new game, leave Rogue Incursion feeling a bit like a missed opportunity. However, with the bombshell reveal of this being part 1 of a larger story, Survios do have another shot at greatness here. Let's hope part 2 isn't just the unfinished and cut second half of this adventure, or more of the same, and is instead a far more exciting, scary, varied, and polished journey into the VR world of Alien.